On a bitter January morning, in 1649, the scaffolding of divine right would finally collapse beneath the weight of accumulated grievances and revolutionary fervor. The man walking steadily across the frozen courtyard of St. James's Palace toward his appointment with destiny was Charles Stuart, once King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, now reduced to a prisoner whose very existence challenged the foundations of the new political order that had arisen from the ashes of civil war. The irony was as sharp as the executioner's blade that awaited him. Charles had been born into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, heir to a tradition that proclaimed kings ruled by divine appointment, their authority flowing directly from God himself. Yet here he stood, condemned by his own subjects as a tyrant, traitor, and enemy of the people he had sworn to protect. The boy who had never expected to wear the crown had become the first English monarch to lose both his throne and his head to the same revolutionary tide. Charles Stuart's journey to the scaffold began long before the first shot was fired in the English Civil War. Born on November 19, 1600, at Dunfermline Palace in Scotland, he entered the world as a second son, safely distant from the burdens of kingship. His father, James VI of Scotland and the First of England, had finally achieved the long-sought union of the two crowns, but the infant Charles seemed destined for a life of comfortable obscurity in the shadow of his elder brother. The child who would one day defy Parliament and claim absolute authority was himself a study in vulnerability. Contemporary accounts describe a sickly boy, so frail that when his father moved the royal family to England in 1603, 2-year-old Charles was left behind in Scotland because the journey was deemed too dangerous for his fragile constitution. He suffered from rickets, that curse of undernourished bones that left him with weak legs and a slight stature he would never fully overcome. Even more limiting was the speech impediment that plagued him throughout his life, a stammer that made public speaking an ordeal rather than the natural expression of royal authority. But perhaps the most profound shaping force in young Charles's development was his relationship with his elder brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. Where Charles was frail and hesitant, Henry was everything a future king should be: tall, athletic, charismatic, and possessed of the natural command that seemed to flow in the bloodline of successful monarchs. Henry's court became a magnet for poets, scholars, and forward-thinking Protestants who saw in him the hope of a new age. The younger brother watched from the margins, adoring and attempting to emulate a sibling who represented everything he was not. The catastrophe that would reshape Charles's destiny arrived with shocking suddenness on November 6, 1612. Prince Henry, in the prime of his 18 years and seemingly destined for greatness, fell victim to typhoid fever. The celebrations planned for their sister Elizabeth's upcoming wedding turned into a period of national mourning. Henry's death was widely viewed as a tragedy not just for the royal family, but for the entire nation. Here was a prince who had promised to be everything his father was not, decisive where James was vacillating, militarily inclined where the king preferred peace, and possessed of a vision for England's future that combined religious reform with national grandeur. Charles, barely 12 years old, suddenly found himself thrust into a role for which he had never been prepared. Overnight, he acquired the traditional titles of the heir apparent, Duke of Cornwall, Duke of Rothesay, and eventually Prince of Wales. The transformation was more than ceremonial. It was psychological. The boy who had grown up expecting to live in his brother's shadow now stood alone in the harsh glare of dynastic expectation. But the brother whose death elevated Charles to heir apparent had done more than simply clear the path to succession. Henry's brief but brilliant career had established a template for kingship that emphasized strength, decisiveness, and Protestant militancy. qualities that seemed to exist in inverse proportion to Charles's own natural disposition. The ghost of the prince who might have been would haunt Charles throughout his life, creating an impossible standard against which he would constantly measure himself and be measured by others. The years following Henry's death saw Charles struggle to overcome both his physical limitations and his psychological insecurities. Through determined effort, he mastered horsemanship and became skilled with weapons, transforming himself from a sickly child into a reasonably accomplished young nobleman. Yet the deeper challenges remained. His stammer never fully disappeared, contributing to a natural reserve that many interpreted as coldness or arrogance. Unlike his gregarious father, who delighted in informal contact with his subjects, Charles remained withdrawn, more comfortable in the formal rituals of court life than in the messy immediacy of public engagement. These personal characteristics would prove politically disastrous, but they were perhaps inevitable given the circumstances of his upbringing. Charles had learned to navigate a world where his fundamental worth was constantly questioned, where his legitimacy as heir apparent rested not on his own merits, but on the biological accident of his brother's death. This experience instilled in him a fierce determination to prove himself worthy of the crown that had fallen to him by default. But it also created a personality that was defensive, secretive, and ultimately unable to compromise when his authority was challenged. The intellectual formation that complemented this psychological development would prove equally crucial to his eventual downfall. Unlike his brother, who had been educated by Protestant scholars, committed to parliamentary cooperation and military engagement with continental Protestantism, Charles fell under the influence of tutors who emphasized the divine right of kings and the absolute nature of royal authority. These ideas found fertile ground in a young man who had every reason to doubt his own natural fitness for kingship, but desperately needed to believe that his authority came from a source higher than human recognition or parliamentary approval. By the time Charles reached adulthood, he had developed a worldview that was fundamentally at odds with the direction English political culture was taking, where his subjects increasingly expected monarchs to rule in partnership with Parliament. Charles believed in the absolute authority of kings. Where the English political class demanded transparency and consultation, Charles preferred the secretive, ceremonial style of continental absolutism. Where Protestant England expected its king to lead the international struggle against Catholic power, Charles was drawn to policies that seemed to flirt with Catholic sympathies. These tendencies were reinforced by his marriage to Henrietta Maria of France in 1625, shortly after his accession to the throne. The match, arranged to cement an alliance with France, immediately aroused suspicion among Charles's Protestant subjects. Henrietta Maria was not merely Catholic, she was the sister of Louis XIII and represented everything that English Protestants feared about continental Catholicism: political absolutism, religious persecution, and foreign influence over English affairs. The early years of the marriage were troubled, marked by cultural misunderstandings and political tensions. Henrietta Maria arrived with a large French entourage that immediately became a source of friction at court. Her open practice of Catholicism and her attempts to influence religious policy created a constant undercurrent of religious anxiety. Charles's decision in 1626 to send her French attendants back to France temporarily improved the political situation, but it could not address the fundamental problem. The King of Protestant England was married to a Catholic princess, whose very presence called into question his commitment to the religious settlement established by his predecessors. Yet gradually, the personal relationship between Charles and Henrietta Maria deepened into genuine affection. The transformation was accelerated by the assassination of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, in 1628. Buckingham had been Charles's closest friend and most trusted advisor, a relationship that had aroused jealousy in the Queen and suspicion among parliamentarians who saw the Duke as a corrupt favourite with too much influence over royal policy. His death removed a barrier to intimacy between the royal couple, while simultaneously depriving Charles of his most important political ally. The growing closeness between Charles and Henrietta Maria would prove to be both a source of personal happiness and political disaster. Their love affair, genuine and touching in its development, produced 9 children and created the kind of partnership that might have strengthened the monarchy under different circumstances. But in the charged atmosphere of 17th century religious politics, their intimacy only deepened suspicions about Catholic influence over the crown. Every policy decision that seemed to favor Catholics or compromise with Catholic powers was attributed to the Queen's influence, whether or not she had actually been involved. These personal dynamics were playing out against the backdrop of increasingly serious constitutional conflicts between the Crown and Parliament. From the beginning of his reign, Charles had demonstrated an impatience with parliamentary criticism and a tendency to interpret any challenge to his policies as an attack on his royal prerogative. This was partly a matter of temperament, but it also reflected his deep-seated belief in the divine right of kings and his conviction that monarchs should not be subject to constraints imposed by their subjects. The financial pressures of government in an age of inflation and military expansion created the specific trigger for constitutional conflict. Like all early modern monarchs, Charles needed parliamentary approval for new taxes, but he also believed that certain areas of policy, particularly foreign affairs and military matters, should remain under exclusive royal control. This created an inevitable tension. Parliament was expected to provide money for policies it had no role in formulating, while the king demanded funding for decisions he refused to explain or justify. The crisis came to a head in 1628 with Parliament's adoption of the Petition of Right, a document that challenged some of the fundamental assumptions of Charles's approach to government. The petition demanded that the king could not levy taxes without parliamentary consent, that subjects could not be imprisoned without just cause, that martial law could not be imposed in peacetime, and that soldiers could not be quartered in private homes without the owner's consent. These were not radical demands in themselves, but they represented a fundamental challenge to Charles's understanding of royal prerogative. Charles's response to the Petition of Right revealed the essential inflexibility that would ultimately destroy him. Rather than seeing it as an opportunity to establish a new partnership with Parliament based on mutual respect for constitutional limits, he interpreted it as an attempt to diminish his authority and reduce him to a mere figurehead. His eventual acceptance of the petition was grudging and accompanied by reservations that made clear his intention to interpret its provisions as narrowly as possible. The final break came in 1629, when Charles dissolved Parliament after a dramatic confrontation in which members physically restrained the Speaker to prevent him from ending the session before they could pass resolutions condemning the king's religious and financial policies. The scene, unprecedented in English parliamentary history, revealed the depth of the constitutional crisis that was developing. Charles had decided that he could govern more effectively without Parliament altogether, while his opponents had concluded that they could not trust him to honor any agreement or respect any constitutional limitation. What followed was the period historians call the personal rule, 11 years during which Charles attempted to govern England without calling Parliament. The experiment was both the logical culmination of his political philosophy and the greatest mistake of his reign. It demonstrated that he could indeed manage the routine business of government without parliamentary involvement, but it also created the accumulation of grievances that would eventually explode into civil war. During those 11 years of personal rule, Charles transformed from a hesitant young king into something far more dangerous, a monarch who genuinely believed he could govern England through the force of his will alone. The experiment that began in March 1629 with the violent dissolution of Parliament would ultimately prove to be both the apogee and the doom of Stuart absolutism. For while Charles succeeded in demonstrating that he could indeed rule without Parliament, he also created the very conditions that would eventually cost him his crown and his head. The period historians call the personal rule was marked by an eerie calm that masked the accumulation of grievances beneath the surface of English political life. Without Parliament to provide a legitimate outlet for opposition, dissent was driven underground, where it festered and multiplied. Charles, insulated within the ceremonial bubble of his court, mistook the absence of visible protest for genuine acceptance of his authority. He failed to understand that his subjects' silence reflected not consent, but the simple lack of any legal mechanism for expressing their growing resentment. At the heart of Charles's governing philosophy during these years was the policy his advisors called thorough, a comprehensive program of administrative centralization designed to make royal authority more efficient and more intrusive than ever before. The architect of this policy was Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, a man whose political transformation from parliamentary critic to royal enforcer would eventually make him the most hated figure in the kingdom. Together with William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Strafford created a system of government that reached into every corner of English life with unprecedented thoroughness. The financial foundations of Charles's independence rested on his exploitation of every conceivable source of non-parliamentary revenue. Ship money, the most notorious of these expedients, transformed an ancient obligation of coastal counties to provide ships for national defense into a general tax levied on all counties, including those far inland. The legal reasoning was tortuous but technically sound. If the realm faced danger, then all subjects benefited from naval protection and should contribute to its cost. What made ship money so particularly offensive was not just its dubious legality, but its efficiency. By 1635, it was raising £200,000 annually, a sum that gave Charles genuine financial independence for the first time in his reign. But ship money was only the most visible manifestation of what contemporaries called fiscal feudalism, the systematic revival of ancient and half-forgotten royal prerogatives for the purpose of raising revenue. Forest laws that had lain dormant for generations were suddenly enforced with draconian severity, imposing massive fines on landowners whose estates had encroached on ancient royal forests. Knighthood fines targeted wealthy men who had failed to present themselves for knighting at Charles's coronation, turning a ceremonial oversight into a lucrative source of revenue. Wardship, the crown's right to manage the estates of minor heirs, was exploited with ruthless efficiency, generating both money and political leverage. These measures were not random acts of greed, but part of a coherent strategy to make the monarchy financially independent of Parliament. Charles understood, as his father had not, that the power to refuse supply was Parliament's ultimate weapon against royal authority. If he could find alternative sources of income, he could rule as he believed kings should rule, according to his own judgment, rather than the whims of his subjects. The strategy worked, at least in the short term. By the mid-1630s, Charles was solvent for the first time since his accession, with customs revenue alone reaching £500,000 as trade expanded. Yet financial independence was only part of Charles's absolutist vision. Equally important was the transformation of English religious life under the guidance of Archbishop Laud. Where Charles's fiscal policies affected primarily the wealthy, Laud's religious reforms touched every parish in England and challenged the fundamental assumptions of Protestant worship that had been developing since the Reformation. Laud's brand of Anglicanism, with its emphasis on ceremony, hierarchy, and clerical authority, struck many Protestants as indistinguishable from Roman Catholicism. The physical transformation of English churches under Laud's direction was both dramatic and symbolically charged. The communion table was moved to the east end of the church and railed off from the congregation, creating what appeared to be a Catholic altar and reinforcing the separation between clergy and laity. Elaborate vestments replaced the simple garb preferred by Protestant ministers. Organ music and incense returned to churches that had been stripped of such popish elements for generations. To committed Protestants, these changes represented not reform but counter-reformation, an attempt to reverse the gains of the previous century and restore England to papal obedience. The theological implications were even more disturbing to Protestant sensibilities. Charles and Laud rejected the doctrine of predestination, a cornerstone of Protestant belief, in favor of Arminian theology that emphasized free will and the possibility of falling from grace. This shift had profound political implications, for predestination had been used to justify resistance to ungodly rulers, while Arminianism suggested that salvation could be lost through disobedience to established authority. The religious and political aspects of Charles's program were thus intimately connected, both working to enhance royal power at the expense of traditional English liberties. The Books of Orders, introduced in January 1631, established a new level of central oversight over local government that many saw as the foundation of continental-style absolutism. These detailed instructions required local officials to report monthly to the Privy Council on their enforcement of royal policy, with the threat of punishment in the Star Chamber for those who failed to comply. The traditional autonomy of local government, one of the distinctive features of English political culture, was systematically undermined in favor of centralized control from Whitehall. The Star Chamber itself became an instrument of political terror, hearing cases in secret and imposing punishments that could include fines, imprisonment, and physical mutilation. William Prynne, Henry Burton, and John Bastwick were pilloried, whipped, and had their ears cropped for publishing pamphlets critical of episcopal authority. These brutal public punishments were designed not just to silence opposition, but to demonstrate the price of challenging royal authority. The spectacle of gentlemen being subjected to punishments, traditionally reserved for common criminals, sent a clear message about the changing nature of power in Charles's England. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Strafford was implementing the policy of thorough with even greater ruthlessness. His administration had improved the Irish economy and boosted tax revenue, but had done so by heavy-handedly imposing order and confiscating land from Catholics for Protestant settlement. More ominously, from an English perspective, he had trained up a large Catholic army in support of the king, creating the spectre of foreign military force being used against English liberties. The success of Strafford's authoritarian methods in Ireland provided a template for what might be attempted in England itself if the system of parliamentary government could be permanently suppressed. Yet for all its efficiency, Charles's system contained the seeds of its own destruction. By 1639, sheriffs were beginning to refuse the collection of ship money because of the hostility they encountered from their neighbors. The Hampton case, in which a Puritan gentleman challenged the legality of ship money in court, had provided a focus for opposition and demonstrated that even Charles's supporters had doubts about the constitutional implications of his policies. Ship money compliance rates fell dramatically, from 98% in 1635 to just 25% by 1639, revealing the limits of what could be achieved through administrative pressure alone. More fundamentally, Charles had created a government that was entirely dependent on his personal authority and the continued absence of any major crisis that might require broader support. The moment he needed to ask his subjects for extraordinary assistance, the careful edifice of absolutist rule would be exposed as the hollow structure it had always been. The crisis that would destroy Charles's system came not from England, but from Scotland, the northern kingdom that he had largely ignored since leaving it as a child, but where his religious policies would encounter their most explosive resistance. In 1637, Charles and Laud decided to impose a new Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church, a revised version of the English prayer book that emphasized ceremony and episcopal authority. The decision reflected Charles's fundamental misunderstanding of Scottish religious culture and his belief that uniformity could be imposed through royal command. The prayer book was written by Scottish bishops under Laud's guidance, but Scottish ministers were excluded from any involvement in its composition, making it appear to be an English imposition on Scottish worship. When the new prayer book was first used in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh on July 23, 1637, the result was an immediate riot that quickly spread throughout the city and then across Scotland. The famous incident of Jenny Geddes throwing her stool at the minister has become symbolic of Scottish resistance, but modern historians suggest it was part of a coordinated campaign of opposition rather than a spontaneous outburst. The riots revealed the depth of Scottish hostility to Charles's religious policies and the extent to which his long absence from his northern kingdom had left him dangerously out of touch with Scottish opinion. The Scottish response was swift and comprehensive. In February 1638, representatives from all sections of Scottish society agreed to a national covenant pledging resistance to liturgical innovations. The covenant was both a religious document and a political manifesto, defending Scottish traditions against English interference while carefully maintaining formal loyalty to the Crown. When the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland met in Glasgow in November 1638, it expelled bishops from the church and effectively declared Scotland's religious independence. Charles's response revealed both his complete misunderstanding of the situation and his fundamental inability to compromise when his authority was challenged. Rather than seeking to understand Scottish grievances or negotiate a settlement that might preserve his religious goals while respecting Scottish sensibilities, he immediately resorted to military force. The decision to make war on Scotland was the fatal mistake that would ultimately cost him his throne, for it required him to do the one thing his entire system of government was designed to avoid: ask Parliament for money. The First Bishops' War in 1639 ended in humiliating failure when Charles's English troops, poorly paid and lacking enthusiasm for a war against fellow Protestants, refused to engage the Scottish army. The Peace of Berwick that ended the First War was little more than a temporary truce, with both sides preparing for renewed conflict. Charles had demonstrated his military weakness while strengthening Scottish resolve, creating the worst possible outcome from his perspective. The failure of the First War left Charles in an impossible position. He could not accept the Scottish defiance of his authority, yet he lacked the resources to mount an effective military campaign. Desperate for funds, he reluctantly summoned Parliament for the first time since 1629, but the short Parliament that met in April 1640 immediately focused on grievances against his government rather than providing money for the Scottish war. When the Commons showed themselves opposed to renewal of the war and insisted on discussing domestic grievances first, Charles dissolved Parliament after less than a month. The dissolution of the short Parliament was Charles's last attempt to maintain his system of personal rule, but it left him with no options for dealing with the Scottish crisis. By the summer of 1640, he faced bankruptcy, with the City of London and foreign powers refusing to provide loans. In his extremity, Charles resorted to desperate expedients, seizing £130,000 in silver bullion held at the Royal Mint and confiscating the East India Company's stock of pepper and spices. These actions destroyed what remained of his credit and demonstrated the regime's fundamental weakness. The Second Bishops' War in 1640 was an even greater disaster than the first, with the Scottish army defeating the English at the Battle of Newburn and occupying Newcastle, the source of London's coal supply. The humiliation was complete when the Treaty of Ripon required Charles not only to accept the Scottish occupation, but to pay the Scottish army £850 per day until a final settlement could be reached. The king, who had claimed to rule by divine right, found himself paying tribute to his own subjects. The military and financial crisis left Charles with no choice but to summon another parliament, and the Long Parliament that assembled on November 3rd, 1640, immediately set about dismantling the entire structure of personal rule. Unlike the Short Parliament, which had been dismissed before it could take decisive action, the Long Parliament moved with systematic determination to ensure that the abuses of the previous 11 years could never be repeated. Strafford, the architect of Thorough, was their primary target, impeached for high treason within days of Parliament's assembly. When he arrived in London on November 9th, 1640, expecting to help Charles deal with Parliament's opposition, he instead found himself facing charges of high misdemeanors regarding his conduct in Ireland. John Pym, the leader of parliamentary opposition, had struck first, ensuring that Strafford would be neutralized before he could organize resistance to Parliament's programme. Archbishop Laud followed Strafford into the Tower in December as Parliament systematically removed the key figures associated with personal rule. The speed and efficiency of these actions demonstrated that opposition to Charles's government had been carefully organized during the years when Parliament was not sitting. The apparent calm of the 1630s had been deceptive. Beneath the surface, networks of opposition had been forming that would prove devastatingly effective once given the opportunity to act. The Triennial Act, passed in February 1641, required Parliament to meet at least every 3 years, and gave the institution the power to assemble itself if the king failed to issue proper summons. This single piece of legislation destroyed the foundation of Charles's system by ensuring that he could never again rule without parliamentary oversight. Ship money and other forms of non-parliamentary taxation were declared illegal, while the Star Chamber and High Commission courts were abolished. The entire apparatus of absolutist government was being methodically dismantled. But Parliament's most dramatic action was the destruction of Strafford himself. When his impeachment trial revealed that the charges against him, while morally damning, might not constitute legal grounds for a death sentence, Pym introduced a bill of attainder that simply declared Strafford guilty and condemned him to death without further trial. The bill passed the Commons by 204 votes to 59, with 250 members abstaining, while massive crowds demonstrated outside Parliament demanding Strafford's head. Charles faced an agonizing decision: save his most loyal servant, or preserve his family's safety in the face of popular rage. When rumors of a military plot to rescue Strafford from the Tower led to widespread demonstrations in London, and the Lords voted for execution by 51-9, Charles's position became impossible. On May 10th, 1641, claiming to fear for his family's safety, Charles signed the death warrant, and Strafford was beheaded 2 days later. The execution of Strafford marked the end of Charles's personal rule and the beginning of his personal nightmare. By sacrificing his most capable minister to save his throne, Charles had demonstrated that even divine right monarchs could be forced to abandon their supporters when the political pressure became sufficient. More ominously, he had established the precedent that those who served the crown too zealously might pay for their loyalty with their lives. The message was not lost on other potential supporters of royal authority. Yet even as Parliament dismantled his system of government, Charles remained fundamentally unable to accept the constitutional revolution that was taking place around him. He viewed every parliamentary action as a temporary setback, rather than a permanent limitation on his authority, believing that he could eventually recover his former power once the immediate crisis had passed. This fundamental misunderstanding of his situation would drive him toward increasingly desperate expedients that would ultimately lead him to the scaffold where Strafford had perished. By the autumn of 1641, Charles Stuart had learned perhaps the most dangerous lesson any ruler can absorb, that even absolute monarchs could be forced to retreat when faced with sufficient pressure. But rather than accepting this as a permanent constraint on his authority, Charles viewed his concessions to Parliament as tactical withdrawals in a longer strategic campaign to recover his lost power. This fundamental misreading of his situation would drive him toward increasingly desperate actions that would ultimately place his head on the executioner's block. The catalyst for the final breakdown came with the Irish Rebellion of October 1641, an uprising that began with attacks on Protestant settlers, but quickly escalated into a general Catholic revolt against English rule. Lurid accounts of massacres reached London, inflaming Protestant opinion and creating demands for immediate military action. But the crisis also revealed the impossible position into which Charles had maneuvered himself. Parliament was willing to raise an army for Ireland, but refused to allow Charles to command it. The issue of military command struck at the heart of the constitutional revolution that was transforming England. For centuries, control of armed forces had been an undisputed royal prerogative, the ultimate expression of sovereign authority. Now, Parliament was demanding that any army raised for Ireland should be commanded by officers appointed by Parliament, rather than the Crown. This was not merely a practical matter of ensuring military effectiveness. It was a direct challenge to the fundamental nature of royal authority. Parliament's distrust was hardly unreasonable. Charles had just sacrificed his most loyal minister to save his own position, demonstrating that his promises of protection meant nothing when his interests were threatened. More ominously, rumors were circulating about plots to use military force to restore royal authority, possibly with Irish Catholic troops playing a decisive role. The spectre of Charles ruling England with an army of Catholic soldiers struck at the deepest fears of Protestant England. Into this explosive atmosphere, John Pym introduced the Grand Remonstrance, a comprehensive indictment of Charles's entire reign that transformed parliamentary opposition into something approaching revolutionary ideology. The document, passed by the narrow margin of 159 votes to 148 on November 22, 1641, listed 204 separate grievances spanning the entire period since Charles's accession. But its significance lay not in its specific complaints, but in its implicit claim that Parliament had the right to dictate the fundamental structure of royal government. The Grand Remonstrance was more than a list of grievances. It was a manifesto for a new form of government, in which royal authority would be permanently subordinated to parliamentary oversight. It demanded that Parliament should approve all royal ministers, control the education of the King's children, and direct the prosecution of the Irish War. Most provocatively, it called for the complete reorganization of the Church of England along Presbyterian lines, including the removal of all bishops from the House of Lords. Charles's response to the Grand Remonstrance revealed both his complete inability to compromise and his fatal misunderstanding of the political situation. Rather than seeking to address Parliament's concerns or build support among moderate members who had been alarmed by the document's radical tone, he immediately began planning to destroy his opponents through direct action. The narrow vote by which the remonstrance had passed convinced him that public opinion was turning in his favour, and that decisive action might yet restore his authority. The most explosive provision of the Grand Remonstrance was Parliament's decision to publish it as a public appeal to the nation. This broke with all constitutional precedent, transforming what should have been a private communication between Crown and Parliament into a public manifesto designed to mobilize popular support against the king. Charles correctly saw this as an attempt to undermine his authority by appealing directly to his subjects, bypassing the traditional channels of royal government. By December 1641, London was convulsed with religious and political demonstrations that revealed the depth of popular hostility to Charles's rule. Crowds gathered outside Parliament, demanding the exclusion of bishops from the House of Lords, while counter-demonstrations by apprentices and supporters of the established church created an atmosphere of near revolution. The capital was dividing into armed camps, with both sides organizing their supporters and preparing for what increasingly seemed like inevitable conflict. The crisis deepened when 12 bishops, attempting to attend the House of Lords, despite the hostile crowds surrounding Parliament, were arrested and imprisoned for protesting that proceedings in their absence were invalid. This dramatic escalation eliminated the king's most reliable supporters in the upper house, while demonstrating Parliament's willingness to use force against its opponents. Charles was watching his constitutional position crumble as the very foundations of royal government came under direct attack. The atmosphere of crisis was heightened by persistent rumors of military plots designed to restore royal authority through force. The army plot earlier in 1641 had involved attempts to use the English army to rescue Strafford and intimidate Parliament. Now there were whispers of new conspiracies involving Irish Catholic troops, foreign intervention, and even plans to seize the Tower of London and arrest parliamentary leaders. Whether these plots were real or imaginary mattered less than their effect on public opinion, which increasingly viewed Charles as a monarch who could not be trusted to respect constitutional limitations. Charles's decision to spend the autumn of 1641 in Scotland, attempting to build support among his northern subjects, only deepened suspicions about his intentions. The incident, a mysterious affair involving alleged plans to kidnap or murder leading Scottish Covenanters, convinced many that Charles was actively plotting against his opponents on both sides of the border. His credibility, already damaged by his sacrifice of Strafford, suffered another devastating blow from which it would never recover. When Charles returned to London in November 1641, he found a capital in the grip of revolutionary fervour and a parliament determined to complete the constitutional revolution it had begun. The moderate royalists who might have supported a compromise settlement had been alienated by the radical tone of recent proceedings, but they were too few and too dispirited to provide Charles with an effective base of support. The king was increasingly isolated, surrounded by a small circle of courtiers who shared his belief that only decisive action could restore royal authority. The breaking point came on January 3rd, 1642, when Charles made the fatal decision to impeach 5 members of the House of Commons for high treason: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Holles, William Strode, and Sir Arthur Haselrig were accused of conspiring with foreign powers and inciting rebellion against the crown. The charges were technically plausible, but politically catastrophic, representing a direct attack on parliamentary privilege that united Charles's opponents while terrifying his potential supporters. The decision to arrest the 5 members was almost certainly influenced by Queen Henrietta Maria, whose French background gave her little understanding of English constitutional traditions and whose Catholic faith made her suspect the motives of every Protestant politician. Her influence over Charles had grown steadily since the death of Buckingham, and she consistently urged him toward more aggressive actions against his opponents. The Queen's intervention in this crucial moment demonstrated how completely Charles had isolated himself from advisors who understood English politics. When Parliament refused to surrender the 5 members, Charles made the most catastrophic decision of his career. He would arrest them himself, using military force if necessary. On January 4th, 1642, accompanied by an armed guard of several hundred soldiers, Charles entered the House of Commons in person, an unprecedented violation of parliamentary privilege that shocked even his supporters. The scene that followed would be remembered as the moment when the English Civil War became inevitable. The 5 members had been warned of Charles's approach and had escaped by boat just before his arrival, but the confrontation between King and Parliament still provided one of the most dramatic moments in English constitutional history. When Charles demanded to know where the fugitives had gone, Speaker William Lenthal delivered the response that would echo through the centuries. "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here." Charles's humiliation was complete. He had violated the fundamental principle of parliamentary independence, demonstrated his willingness to use force against his own subjects, and achieved nothing except to unite all his opponents against him. As he left Westminster, cries of "Privilege! Privilege!" followed him through the corridors, and he must have realized that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The attempt to arrest the 5 members was the act that made civil war inevitable. The immediate aftermath of the failed coup attempt saw Charles's position in London become untenable. Crowds gathered outside Whitehall demanding justice for the violation of parliamentary privilege, while the City of London organized its militia in support of Parliament. Fearing for his family's safety, Charles abandoned his capital on January 10th, 1642, beginning a journey that would eventually lead him to the scaffold. The king, who had once claimed to rule by divine right, was now a fugitive from his own subjects. The outbreak of the English Civil War on August 22nd, 1642, when Charles raised his standard at Nottingham, marked the beginning of 7 years of conflict that would claim the lives of perhaps 200,000 people, a greater proportion of the population than died in World War I. The war began as a struggle over constitutional principles, but quickly became something far more fundamental, a fight for the soul of English civilization between competing visions of religious, political, and social order. The early phases of the conflict seemed to favor neither side decisively. At the Battle of Edgehill in October 1642, Charles's nephew Prince Rupert demonstrated the effectiveness of cavalry charges against parliamentary forces, but the battle ended inconclusively, with both armies claiming victory. The Royalists advanced toward London, but were stopped at Turnham Green by the trained bands of the city, missing their best opportunity to end the war through a single decisive blow. Charles established his wartime capital at Oxford, creating a rival government that claimed to represent the legitimate authority of the crown against parliamentary usurpation. For a time, it seemed possible that England might fragment into permanently hostile kingdoms, with Charles ruling from Oxford, while Parliament controlled London and the southeast. The king's forces were particularly strong in Wales, the southwest, and parts of the north, regions where traditional loyalties to the crown remained powerful. But Parliament possessed crucial advantages that became more apparent as the war continued. Control of London gave them access to the city's wealth and the customs revenues that were the government's largest source of income. The navy sided almost entirely with Parliament, preventing foreign aid from reaching Charles, while allowing parliamentary forces to maintain contact with their Scottish allies. Most importantly, Parliament's cause attracted the support of men who fought with the kind of religious conviction that could sustain armies through the darkest moments of defeat. The transformation of the war came with Parliament's alliance with Scotland through the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. In exchange for Scottish military support, Parliament agreed to establish Presbyterian church government in England and Scotland, effectively committing the country to a religious revolution as radical as the political one already underway. The entry of 20,000 Scottish troops into northern England fundamentally altered the military balance and doomed Charles's hopes of victory. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Marston Moor on July 2nd, 1644, where the combined parliamentary and Scottish forces destroyed the main royalist army in the north. The victory was largely due to Oliver Cromwell's cavalry, which demonstrated a new kind of military discipline that combined religious fervor with tactical effectiveness. Cromwell's Ironsides did not simply charge and scatter like traditional cavalry. They maintained formation, regrouped, and charged again, providing the kind of sustained pressure that could win battles rather than simply disrupting enemy formations. The defeat at Marston Moor cost Charles control of the north and demonstrated that his forces could not match the increasingly professional armies that Parliament was fielding. More ominously, it revealed the emergence of a new kind of military leader in Oliver Cromwell, a man who combined tactical genius with revolutionary political vision, and who would eventually prove to be Charles's nemesis. Parliament's creation of the new model army in 1645 marked the final phase of Charles's military downfall. This professional force of 22,000 men, commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax with Cromwell as Lieutenant General of Cavalry, represented everything that royalist armies were not: disciplined, well-paid, ideologically motivated, and capable of sustained campaigning. The self-denying ordinance that accompanied its creation removed members of Parliament from military command, ensuring that the army would be led by professional soldiers rather than political appointees. The Battle of Naseby on June 14, 1645, saw the new model army destroy Charles's main field force in a victory so complete that it effectively ended his hopes of military success. The capture of Charles's personal correspondence after the battle revealed the extent to which he had been seeking help from Catholic Ireland and foreign powers, permanently destroying his credibility with moderate Protestants who might have supported a negotiated settlement. Perhaps more damaging than the military defeat was the publication of the King's Cabinet Opened, a collection of Charles's private letters that revealed his duplicity in negotiations and his willingness to use foreign troops against his own subjects. The letters showed that while Charles had been publicly negotiating with Parliament, he had privately been encouraging his wife to seek French military intervention and had been planning to use Irish Catholic forces to reconquer England. The revelation that their king had been systematically lying to them completed the alienation of those who had hoped for a peaceful resolution. By 1646, Charles's military position was hopeless. Oxford surrendered in June, and Charles himself fled north to surrender to the Scottish army, apparently believing that his Scottish subjects would prove more amenable than the English Parliament. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Scots handed him over to Parliament in January 1647, beginning his final journey toward the scaffold. The period of Charles's captivity from 1647 to 1649 revealed his continued inability to accept the reality of his situation. Despite his military defeat and political isolation, he remained convinced that his opponents would eventually be forced to accept his terms. His escape from Hampton Court Palace in November 1647, followed by his alliance with Scotland that sparked the Second Civil War in 1648, convinced his captors that he could never be trusted to honor any agreement. The Second Civil War was brief but decisive. Cromwell's victories at Preston and other engagements demonstrated that royalist resistance was futile, while radicalizing parliamentary opinion against any further negotiations with the king. The army's growing conviction that Charles was a man of blood who bore personal responsibility for the deaths of thousands of his subjects made his eventual trial and execution almost inevitable. Pride's purge in December 1648, when Colonel Thomas Pride excluded moderate members from Parliament, created the Rump Parliament that would eventually try Charles for his life. The remaining members, numbering fewer than 80, were dominated by men who believed that the king's continued existence was incompatible with the security of the Commonwealth they were trying to create. The decision to try Charles for treason was unprecedented in European history. Never before had a reigning monarch been brought before a court of his own subjects to answer for his actions. The legal foundation was shaky. Traditional law recognized no authority higher than the king, but Parliament declared itself competent to create new laws for extraordinary circumstances. The High Court of Justice that convened on January 20th, 1649, claimed to act in the name of the people of England against a king who had betrayed his trust. Charles's trial was as much a political performance as a legal proceeding. His refusal to recognize the court's authority or enter a plea was both constitutionally correct and tactically disastrous, allowing his accusers to present their case without effective rebuttal. The charges were comprehensive: that he had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, and had sought to uphold in himself an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will, and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people. The witnesses who testified against Charles painted a picture of a king who had consistently placed his personal authority above the welfare of his subjects. Soldiers described how Charles had refused offers of negotiation and had continued fighting even when defeat was inevitable. The prosecution's case was that Charles had violated the fundamental contract between ruler and ruled, making himself an enemy of the very people he was sworn to protect. Charles's dignity during the trial proceedings won him sympathy even from some opponents, but it could not alter the verdict that had been predetermined by political necessity. On January 27th, 1649, the court declared him guilty of high treason and sentenced him to death by the severing of his head from his body. 59 commissioners signed the death warrant, including Oliver Cromwell, whose large, bold signature demonstrated his commitment to seeing the judgment carried out. The final 3 days of Charles's life revealed both his genuine courage and his continued inability to understand what his reign had wrought. He spent his time in prayer with Bishop William Juxon, destroyed his private papers, and bid farewell to his younger children, Elizabeth and Henry. His instruction to young Henry never to accept a crown while his elder brothers live demonstrated that even facing death, Charles remained committed to the dynastic principles that had guided his life. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles dressed carefully for his execution, requesting 2 shirts so that any shivering from cold would not be mistaken for fear. The walk from St. James's Palace to Whitehall, surrounded by ranks of soldiers, must have been a surreal experience for a man who had once commanded the loyalty of 3 kingdoms. The crowds lining the route were held so far back by guards that most could not even see the man who had once been their king. The scaffold erected outside the banqueting house was draped in black cloth and raised high enough that the thousands of spectators could witness the unprecedented spectacle of a king's execution. The symbolism was unmistakable. The building where Charles had once entertained foreign ambassadors, beneath Rubens's ceiling, celebrating royal power, would now witness the violent end of the Stuart monarchy's absolutist pretensions. Charles's final speech, heard only by those immediately around him on the scaffold, was a mixture of defiance and resignation. He insisted that he had always sought his subjects' welfare, but maintained that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. He refused to admit guilt for the civil wars, while accepting his fate as divine judgment for his sins, particularly his failure to save the Earl of Strafford from execution 8 years earlier. The moment of execution itself was swift and clean. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Charles gave the signal to the masked executioner, and a single blow of the axe severed his head from his body. The crowd's reaction was immediate and complex. Some cheered, others wept, but most stood in stunned silence at what they had witnessed. A groan went up from the thousands of spectators as they realized they had just seen something that would change England forever. The immediate aftermath of the execution was carefully managed by the new Republican government. Charles's body was embalmed and buried quietly at Windsor Castle, denied the magnificent funeral that might have created a shrine for royalist sentiment. The Commonwealth government worked quickly to establish its legitimacy while suppressing any immediate royalist reaction to the king's death. But the execution of Charles I created more problems than it solved. Within hours of his death, his eldest son was proclaimed King Charles II in Scotland and Ireland, ensuring that the succession question would continue to plague the Commonwealth. More fundamentally, the regicides had created a martyr whose memory would prove more powerful than his living presence had ever been. The publication of Icon Basilique, purporting to be Charles's own reflections on his life and reign, transformed the dead king into a saintly figure who had died for his principles. The book became one of the best-selling publications of the 17th century, creating a royalist mythology that portrayed Charles as a Christ-like figure betrayed by his own subjects. This powerful propaganda proved far more effective than anything the living Charles had ever managed to produce. The long-term consequences of January 30th, 1649, extended far beyond the immediate establishment of the Commonwealth. The execution established the principle that even kings were subject to law and accountable to their subjects, a revolutionary concept that would echo through subsequent centuries. It demonstrated that divine right monarchy could be challenged and destroyed by determined opposition, providing a precedent that would inspire later revolutions. Yet the execution also revealed the limitations of revolutionary change imposed from above. The Commonwealth government never managed to establish genuine popular legitimacy, remaining dependent on military force to maintain its authority. The English people, traumatized by civil war and the unprecedented act of regicide, gradually turned against the stern republicanism of the interregnum and welcomed the restoration of monarchy in 1660. The ultimate irony of Charles I's execution was that it failed to achieve its intended purpose of ending the threat of royal absolutism. When Charles II returned to the throne, he proved far more politically skillful than his father, managing to maintain royal authority while avoiding the constitutional confrontations that had destroyed his predecessor. The lesson learned was not that kingship was impossible, but that successful kings must know when to compromise. As the executioner held up the severed head of Charles Stuart for the crowd to see, he completed a revolution that had begun with the refusal of a few members of Parliament to be silenced by royal authority. The boy who had never expected to be king, who had been thrust into succession by his brother's death, and had spent his life trying to prove himself worthy of a crown that had fallen to him by accident, had finally achieved a unique distinction. He became the only English monarch to lose his head to his own subjects' judgment. The blood that flowed from the scaffold that January afternoon was more than the life force of one man. It was the final ebbing of a conception of monarchy that had claimed to derive its authority from God alone. In its place would eventually emerge a new understanding of royal power as something granted by the people and subject to constitutional limitation. Charles I had died defending the divine right of kings, but his death had killed that very principle more thoroughly than any theoretical argument ever could. The scaffold at Whitehall had served its grisly purpose, transforming a failed king into a cautionary tale that would resonate through centuries of English political development. Charles Stuart's head had been severed from his body, but the ideas for which he had died would prove far more difficult to kill.